enjoyed their first few days of summer. Thank you for joining me today for the Violence Prevention 101 Avoiding Common Traps training. My name is Madison Van Epps, and I am a training consultant with NC CASA. And today is actually my last training of the 5 that I've been doing for NC CASA. So today in our webinar, please feel free to ask questions either in the chat or by raising your hand at the bottom of the Zoom. You can raise and lower your hand, and if you do that, I believe I'll be able to see that you've raised it, and I can either unmute you or give you the opportunity to share in the chat your comment or question. To begin, just a little bit about NC CASA and the work that we do. The North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault is a statewide inclusive alliance that is working to end sexual violence through education, advocacy, and legislation. Sexual violence includes human trafficking within the sex trades, child sexual exploitation, and sexual harassment and assault. That is part of the force and coercion that is used in human trafficking. And NC CASA has been engaged in anti-trafficking work since 2004. At NC CASA, we use a social justice framework, meaning we try to do our work from a strong intersectional social justice perspective. We center our work around marginalized communities so that we know that everyone is being served. We know that when we do not center marginalized communities in our work, that their needs will not be met and the voices may not be heard. So as I mentioned, at NC CASA, we work to end sexual violence through education, advocacy, and legislation. And so here's a few of the things that we do within our work. At NC CASA, we organize and sponsor statewide trainings related to sexual violence. We support rape crisis programs. We do resource sharing and technical assistance, support legislative agendas and policy change, both at the local and national level. We complete anti-human trafficking outreach, and we provide prevention education. At the beginning of our trainings, we like to acknowledge that not all women are victims, not all men are perpetrators. Any gender can be a victim and any gender can be a perpetrator. This is especially important to acknowledge in today's conversation as we talk about the ways in which the anti-trafficking movement has historically maybe perpetuated stereotypes unintentionally or non-realities of who can be a victim or who can be a perpetrator. Just to begin, I'd like to share a little bit about me with you all. I'm originally from a small town in Michigan, which is actually back where I am now. It's called Owasso, Michigan. I graduated with my undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan in 2019 in community and global health. For the last 2 years, I've been studying at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and I just graduated last month with my Master of Public Health in Maternal, Child, and Family Health. During my graduate program, I worked in the summer of 2020 with NC CASA to create the Human Trafficking Prevention Curriculum Matrix, which I will share a little bit about here in a moment. And since January, I've continued to work with NC CASA as a training consultant, delivering 5 trainings, as I mentioned, that were created based on the end product of the Prevention Curriculum Matrix. And as I mentioned, today is actually my last training with NC CASA. I just moved back to Michigan a few weeks ago after graduation, and you all are the first that I've been able to share this with. I start Monday. I just got a full-time position as the health communications specialist with the Ingham County Health Department in Michigan. So I'm really excited to be beginning that here in the near future. So that is a little bit about me. Let's see. And if everyone can take a moment in the chat, I'd love to learn a little bit about who is joining us today. So what kind of agency do you work for? Introduce yourself and include your pronouns, please. What do you do at your agency, and where is your agency? We have some people from North Carolina, from NC Casa, DC, Asheville, Rayford, thank you everyone for introducing yourselves, and thanks for the congrats. I'm going to keep going, but please feel free to keep introducing yourselves and be active in the chat with each other if you'd like to. Today's presentation, we have 4 main groups that are important to focus on in talking about common traps that have existed historically within the movement, and that unintentionally or intentionally continue to at times show themselves in the movement as well. And so today's presentation will first begin with me introducing the human trafficking prevention curriculum matrix, and then we'll go through a few of common traps. So victim blaming, the use of sensationalized language and imagery, inclusivity in the movement, and how we can evaluate and improve the movement as we move forward. And I just want to mention that these are not going to be completely comprehensive to the ways in which the anti-trafficking movement has grown or learned, but will help us to understand ways in which we can continue to improve our own anti-trafficking work and make sure that we are avoiding common traps in our work and as we continue to grow the movement. So today's presentation, I'll begin by sharing the work that I have completed previously with NC Casa and how we came to today's presentation. In 2015, the North Carolina General Legislature passed Session Law 2015-279, which mandated the inclusion of sex trafficking prevention education and reproductive health education in North Carolina schools. So here I've included the language that was utilized in the mandate. The mandate required that each school administration collaborate with a diverse group of outside consultants, including law enforcement, with expertise in sex trafficking prevention education to address the threats of sex trafficking, as well as collaborate with a diverse group of outside consultants, including law enforcement with expertise in sex trafficking, on creating a referral protocol for high-risk pupils and minors. The materials that are used within the health education classes to teach sex trafficking must be age appropriate. The information shall be objective and based upon scientific research that's peer reviewed, and also accepted by professionals and credentialed experts in the field of sexual health education. And law enforcement agencies, criminal justice agencies, and non-governmental organizations with expertise in sex trafficking prevention and awareness may also provide materials and information. So unsurprisingly, after this mandate was enacted, many schools were unsure of where or how to find human trafficking prevention curriculum, or how to identify which curriculum of many that exist would be best in their classrooms and in their school district, especially when the mandate requires that the curriculum be based upon scientific research, peer-reviewed, and accepted by professionals in the field. We can all agree that there are often times that legislation or mandates are put into place with hopes of creating positive change, but without adequate support or resources to be properly implemented, they may not show as great of success as well as was intended. So schools were now mandated to introduce sex trafficking prevention education for their students, but it left the question of how do we find the best curriculum for our district based on our needs and how our community operates. And so that it was a big barrier for schools. So those same barriers that I just mentioned on the last slide to implementation of the mandate were recognized by the Sexual Violence Prevention Advisory Council, also known as SVPAC. SVPAC is a gathering of statewide professionals in North Carolina from a variety of public health and education fields that have experience in violence prevention. Specifically, their K-12 education work group focuses on strengthening sexual violence prevention efforts in both primary and secondary education settings. And so after recognizing and determining the barriers that were inhibiting local school districts from following the mandate, they identified the need for a resource that would be a clear outline of available curriculum for North Carolina schools for sex trafficking prevention education. And so this resource would be used by local school districts to meet the mandate through the ability to look at a variety of curriculum that exist and compare relevant logistical and content information so that schools could make an informed decision about their sex trafficking prevention strategy, and the curriculum that would best serve their needs in their school. And so this is where my work began. I worked with NC CASA to create the Human Trafficking Prevention Curriculum Matrix, to create that resource that would be used to address the barriers that were noted after the introduction of Session Law 2015-279. And so the Human Trafficking Prevention Curriculum Matrix breaks down 14 different trafficking prevention curriculum that elected to be included in the resource when we reached out to anti-trafficking organizations. The matrix is not an evaluation or an endorsement of these 14 curriculums by NC CASA, but instead it provides information for school districts to make a more informed decision for themselves. So the ability to look at the 14 varying curriculum and based on the information provided, look to see what would fit best in their district. So the Human Trafficking Prevention Curriculum Matrix addresses the questions of where or how to find human trafficking prevention curriculum, how to identify which curriculum would be best for our district, and it provides information about the resources or support that schools may need to implement a curriculum in their district. And so the matrix has three main sections. The logistics of implementation. So this would include the methods for developing the content in the curriculum and the logistics of implementing the curriculum into a school district. So for each of the 14 curriculum included in the matrix, there will be information about, for example, whether a curriculum costs money to put into place or whether it costs money to train someone, whether the curriculum is available in various languages or whether it was developed using survivors of human trafficking's input. And so really asking information about how did you create this curriculum and what would it take for our school to implement it within our district. The content section of the matrix details information on the specificity of the curriculum and key information that they target within their curriculum. So does the curriculum look at healthy relationships, consent, labor trafficking, et cetera, other content that is often talked about in human trafficking prevention. And the final main section covers the risk and protective factors. The list was developed using Teach to Reach resource titled Risk Factors for Experiencing Sex Trafficking. And so the risk and protective factors included those that exist at the individual, relationship, community, and societal. And for each curriculum, there was a checked box whether they addressed each risk factor. So you could look and see this curriculum addressed a lot at the individual level, but they really don't look at risk and protective factors at the societal level, or vice versa. And so the main goal of this project was to provide support to school districts in making an informed choice about a curriculum for their health education classes through providing a comprehensive resource that laid out information in a very clear and digestible format. In creating a matrix of 14 different curriculum, the information that they teach and include within their lesson plan varies. And that's why we thought it was so important to create the matrix so schools could look at the information and decide for themselves which maybe information was most important to them or how it was implemented. And so today's presentation was created to, one, acknowledge that there are many different ways of teaching anti-trafficking lessons that exist right now, whether that be from an empathy approach or an anti-oppression lens. But two, in doing so, make sure that as we take different approaches in the anti-trafficking movement, we are sure that we're not falling into common traps and promoting practices or knowledge that are outdated in the movement or are setting us back in the work that we've acknowledged and the information we've learned to grow, and that we're continuing to move forward. So I'll stop really quickly and ask just if anyone has any questions in the chat regarding the matrix or its development before I go on into the next section. Okay, I'll keep going, but if anyone has any questions, please let me know. The first section we will look at today as common traps in prevention is victim blaming. Victim blaming can be identified as someone saying, implying, or treating a person who has experienced harmful or abusive behavior as it was a result of a result of something they did or said, instead of placing the responsibility where it belongs, which is on the person who harmed them or chose to harm them. And so in the anti-trafficking movement, it's important to acknowledge that victim blaming can be done both intentionally and unintentionally, whether we mean to accidentally blame the victim, whether we mean to blame the victim, or we are perpetuating behaviors or language that blames the victim unintentionally. So either way, the education, the speech, the imagery that intentionally or unintentionally blames the victim or harms the anti-trafficking movement needs to be recognized so that we can move forward and make sure that we're not harming individuals who are either victims or who are working against human trafficking in the movement. The premise of victim blaming is saying that the trafficking survivors have chosen this life in some capacity, and therefore they're responsible for the consequences of that decision. Victim blaming ignores that trafficking requires force, fraud, and coercion of a trafficker. Trafficking cannot occur without someone choosing to traffic, choosing to use force and coercion to traffic someone. One way that victim blaming can occur is when we teach self-defense methods of teaching, such as how not to get trafficked. And so we want to be careful that our language doesn't promote the idea that trafficking is the fault of a person who is trafficked not being safe enough or making poor choices. So questions such as, well, why did they go home with them? Or why did they get so drunk? Why didn't they do this? Put the blame on the victim, saying if they didn't engage in these behaviors, then they wouldn't have been trafficked. But that ignores the fact still that someone was choosing to traffic. And so it's not engaging in these behaviors that cause trafficking. It's someone choosing to traffic and putting in place the force, fraud, or coercion. Additionally, language such as he, she, or they chose to do this is another form of victim blaming. It attempts to simplify the complex nature of trafficking experiences and what it means to feel safe or to be vulnerable. The idea of choice feels different when you're living in survival mode, or you feel like you have no options, or you're choosing between limited options. If an individual feels that they have to choose between two options, for example, maybe one living with your family who doesn't support your gender identity, that's really harmful to your mental health, or living with the trafficker who is supportive of your gender identity. The trafficking option for some may feel safer when those are the only two options that you have. And so simplifying it to they chose to do this in our education or in our works, language such as that blames the victim for a really tough decision in which they feel they are attempting to make the best option for themselves given the options that they feel that they have. So language such as they chose to do this really simplifies a complex relationship between safety and vulnerability. Instead, there are methods for discussing prevention of trafficking that steer away from victim blaming and instead focus on creating sustainable approaches to prevention. So for example, trafficking prevention education can focus on creating an informed individual who understands ideas for being safer and how to make informed choices. In the next slide, we will watch a few videos that help to demonstrate this idea. But teaching young people how to be more informed in their everyday life, such as on social media or in their personal relationships, in the ways in which they consume information, is helpful in avoiding victim blaming, because we're not focusing on how not to get trafficked, but instead, how do you be a more informed individual in the choices that you're making? instead of saying you can't do this, this is how you do this safely. And so we know that youth are engaging in risky behaviors at times, and it may come from a place of curiosity. But if we teach them about how to do it safely and how to understand the systems and how they operate, they will be better equipped with what to expect and how to manage it. And so making a more informed decision-making process. As well, it is beneficial to not only focus on prevention of being trafficked, but teaching prevention of perpetration. So as I mentioned earlier, someone cannot be trafficked or be vulnerable to being trafficked without another individual choosing to traffic. And so teaching methods for prevention of perpetration takes the focus away from the victim. Instead says, let's stop trafficking behaviors and patterns before they even occur, instead of focusing on how not to become a victim of trafficking. So let's teach education about stopping behaviors of perpetration, as opposed to teaching ideas for how not to get trafficked. And so in creating an informed decision-making approach or teaching youth to be safer, I have two videos that I'd like to watch today. The first, we'll just watch a part of it, is a TED Talk by Dr. Rothman, who teaches porn literacy. Rothman has completed research in violence prevention and found that teaching youth about media literacy and porn literacy allowed youth to consider various perspectives and information and make informed decisions for themselves. Whether youth choose to engage in watching porn or not, Rothman argues that using pornography as a talking point helps youth to be critical thinkers and have conversations about how to have healthy relationships. So we'll watch, we have about 7 minutes, I think. So Rothman goes on to talk a little bit more about media and porn literacy. And she notes that it's successful because that the youth are able to remain engaged in the conversations because they allow them to grapple with the complexities and think about how it plays into healthy relationships. And because they're honest about the science that exists and the knowledge that they have, that youth are allowed to think for themselves, and then be more informed in their decision-making processes, and just be able to make more informed decisions. And so this second short video is a clip from NC's CASA's Let's Talk About It campaign. And this video actually comes with facilitation guides for both youth and adults about conversations that can follow after watching the videos and what it can teach you. And so this video demonstrates a real example that youth may encounter on social media.
Hey, what's up?
So this random guy just messaged me on Instagram. It was really weird. What do I do?
I hate when that happens. If he made you feel weird, you should definitely block him. No explanations, no apologies. You don't owe somebody your time.
Yeah, I guess. It's just annoying when people make me feel uncomfortable online. We should all feel safe, right? Do you have a minute? I still feel really weird about it.
Yeah, for sure. Let's talk about it.
There we go. And so this short video demonstrates, unfortunately, a real example and common occurrence that happens on social media, but it gives a starting point for really important conversations, validating feelings about how it may be uncomfortable to receive unsolicited messages on social media. And it provides a quick example of how youth can manage those emotions, how they can reach out to their friends or someone that they trust, and validates this is how you may feel, and it's normal and appropriate to then reach out to someone you trust for comfort or advice. And I think this video does a really good job of demonstrating how we need to normalize conversations about what is occurring on social media, how it makes us feel, and what steps we can take. And so both of these videos, while different, I think both demonstrate that youth are going to continue to use social media or porn. But how do we create conversations and education and methods for teaching them to do it safely, and being informed in using these types of media? And so how do we take the complexities of social media and healthy relationships and pornography, and teach them how to understand its complexities? And I think that's really important work to be doing in the movement. It's easy to think this isn't happening, but it is, and doing it in an informed way will help youth in the long run. Oops. Sorry. Another common trap that we see within the movement that falls under the umbrella of victim blaming, and this isn't necessarily occurring among anti-trafficking organizations or sexual violence prevention organizations, but maybe by individuals who are attempting to educate themselves, or the way that human trafficking is portrayed in the media, or just conversations that occur unintentionally. And so, is the conflation of sex work versus sex trafficking. So sex work is when a person willingly takes part in the sale of sex. It is consensual and doesn't affect their human rights. So sex work can be willingly chosen from a range of options, and it means that there's enthusiastic consent. One crucial point to make is that all commercial sex involving a minor is legally considered human trafficking. Commercial sex involving an adult is human trafficking if the person providing commercial sex is doing so against his or her will as a result of force, fraud, or coercion. Sex trafficking is when a person takes part in the sale of sex through threat, force, fraud, or coercion. If commercial sex no longer includes enthusiastic consent, and an individual is doing it against their will, they are now being forced into human or sex trafficking. And so the conflation of sex work and sex trafficking can be very harmful for both sex workers and victims of sex trafficking. When sex work is conflated with trafficking, the popular opinion, or how the general public perceives sex work is that is exploitation and suffering. The conflation is then that sex work means they're being forced to do this. And because of the stigma, sex workers are then denied maybe worker status as individuals. They're denied worker status as individuals who contribute to our economy. And where sex workers have worked really hard to improve working conditions towards gaining their autonomy and respect in the general public and in the economy, the conflation of trafficking and sex work has taken away the power of those that have chosen to work within the sex industry and are doing that with autonomy. Additionally, in conflating sex work and sex trafficking, individuals who are being trafficked may be perceived as those who are willing to engage in sex work. And this conflation may mean that victims aren't receiving the support or resources they need to get out of their situation. And I want to acknowledge that this can be a really difficult conversation, and it may feel really difficult to understand where the line is drawn. And so the true difference in understanding exploitation and consent and their role in both sex work and sex trafficking, the true difference is understanding the exploitation and consent. And so it's important just to think about in the ways that you either talk about sex work or sex trafficking in your work, or you see it presented in the media, that you're thinking critically about where the line is drawn, and how the conflation of sex work versus sex trafficking can be possibly harmful to the movement. Similarly to, Krista, do you want to share something?
Yeah, I did. I actually, I just was going to jump in because just in the last few days, I've had access to a pre-publication copy of an article that'll be coming out in the Journal of Health Services Research and Policy, I believe. But it was some research where they surveyed medical providers, which isn't the same as, lawyers or direct service crisis advocates. But what they found is that a lot of the healthcare providers in this big survey actually avoided screening for sex trafficking and did not do as good of a job addressing the healthcare needs of people who were potentially survivors to find out if there was force, fraud, or coercion or how they could help them, because they did not feel confident in differentiating between sex trafficking and consensual sex work, which then caused them to not ask questions. They didn't want to seem judgmental if someone was engaged in consensual sex work, but the training they had received on sex trafficking had not prepared them to differentiate. And it actually led to reduced confidence in meeting the healthcare needs of those patients. And so I just wanted to mention that was something that was interesting for me to see, that without real clear distinction between those two, that we do, at least in healthcare, see that connected directly to poorer outcomes in the care that survivors receive. And I would imagine that relates to other fields as well. That's all.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really important research to be done. And later in the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about unintended impact or harm of these common pitfalls in the movement. And that would definitely fall under looking at the unintended impact or harm of trying to create solutions to serve survivors or in the anti-trafficking movement, but instead further creating harm. This next section will look at sensationalized language and imagery that is used in the anti-trafficking movement. This language or imagery may be used or created and perpetuate unrealistic experiences of trafficking, stereotypes, or using imagery and language that can further harm victims. And as the movement continues to grow and learn and adapt based on new experiences or information, we must continue to update our language and imagery so that we're not sensationalizing the reality of survivors of trafficking. We don't want to use language or imagery that promotes feelings or emotions for the sake of giving emotion to the movement, but it doesn't depict accurate realities of the movement and the work that's being done or experiences of survivors. There are times in the anti-trafficking movement where we may say things without intending to mean harm, but in reflection are misrepresenting the issue of trafficking or the experiences of survivors. There are words and phrases that have been used within the trafficking movement by media, by presidents, by law enforcement, by us, by me, before I maybe was taught to do better or took the time to teach myself to do better, that sensationalize the work that we are doing. And they're phrases that we come to learn don't support the work or support the future of the movement. So it's important to avoid language that sensationalizes the issues or misrepresents human trafficking or further blames and stigmatizes trafficking victims and survivors. So for example, the phrase, "it could even happen to good kids," or phrases such as "not in my backyard." Phrases like these build on stereotypical ways that trafficking was presented in the media and videos in the past and at times still now, which may include narratives of a white innocent cheerleader, what is depicted as a good kid. The phrase "it could even happen to good kids" further creates the divide that anyone can be a victim and anyone can be a perpetrator. Language such as this says, well, it typically doesn't happen among these populations, whether that be kids who do poorly in school or involved in crime, but hey, now that it's occurring among good kids, we should be concerned. Language such as this just puts a divide between looking at victims and perpetrators, and takes away from the movement in that we know that anyone can be a victim and anyone can be a perpetrator, and saying it could even happen to good kids further perpetuates stereotypes and harmful depictions of what the anti-trafficking movement is. The term modern day slavery is used very often in describing describing human trafficking now. It's on a lot of websites, it's used in the media, but using language such as modern day slavery or sex slaves minimizes the historical experiences that were experienced during slavery and among the African community. So using these phrases to describe experiences of trafficking minimizes the enslavement of an entire population whose experiences are separate from those of trafficking. And using the phrase modern day slavery, it's often used to evoke an emotion or power that is attached to historical slavery and its ramifications, but it does not represent the differences in the experiences of trafficking versus slavery. And so I think that's often used to try to create emotion or depict the anti-trafficking movement, but they're separate experiences and experiences of survivors and victims of each of these different trafficking versus slavery should be identified. The phrase being a voice for the voiceless, this phrase should not be a goal of organizations in the anti-trafficking movement. Individuals who have experienced trafficking or victims or survivors of trafficking have voices and have experiences to share, but we are not actively listening or doing the support or giving the support or resources needed to let them share that voice. So they need support, resources, and to be heard, not being a voice for them, but listening instead to what they have to say. So they don't need someone to speak for them, they need the support and someone to listen. And so it's not that victims or survivors are voiceless, but that they're unheard or overlooked in the movement. As well, it's important in our language and examples that we use in our education, our materials, our curriculum, that we are remembering to phrase the experiences of survivors and victims as events that occurred within their life, but not their entire identity. Being a survivor of trafficking is a description of someone's relationship to an experience. It's not a skill set or an identity. Just because someone has experienced trafficking or is a survivor or victim of trafficking, that is not their entire life. They have, it is not their identity solely. And so being intentional about using language and examples that demonstrate life after trafficking and elicit that there's hope beyond trafficking events help move the movement forward instead of focusing on the harsh details of an experience. And so I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that our language and the way we discuss trafficking, whether that be through us or the media or through the materials we put out, is how the world sees the trafficking movement and how we share information about human trafficking. So if we continue work to use intentional language and focus on the strength and resilience of survivors, then we can most successfully share how to combat trafficking, how to be knowledgeable and informed, and how to support the movement. So this is an example from the IRENA project. The IRENA project is based out of the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media, and they work to monitor how sex trafficking is presented in the media and advocate for the responsible and accurate coverage of sex trafficking in the media. And so here's one example they give about avoiding sensationalized language that misrepresents and harms the anti-trafficking movement. So instead of using the phrase child prostitute, teen prostitute, or minor prostitute, use victim or survivor of child sexual abuse, trafficked minor, or commercially exploited child. And they say that they suggest this swap because by law, there's no consent or choice when the victim is a minor. Thus, child prostitute is an inaccurate term. It, and terms like it, criminalize and stigmatize trafficking victims. And so the swap in the language and using intentional language, such as those in the middle section, acknowledge that there's no consent or choice when the victim is a minor. They cannot consent to the selling of sex, so therefore the phrase child prostitute criminalizes and stigmatizes youth trafficking victims. Being intentional about the language that we choose to use in depicting elements of the trafficking movement, make sure that we're representing the truth of the fraud and coercion that trafficking utilizes. Furthermore, language such as child prostitute used to describe a victim may cause us to see the child as a criminal or someone unworthy of services and support. And so it can further harm the work of the environment or work of the movement, whether that be providing adequate services or for minors to seek support. And so I think it's important to recognize that there were times when it was normalized to use the language such as child prostitute, teen prostitute, minor prostitute. But as we've learned from evidence and information and knowledge that we've learned in the movement, using the ones such as victim or survivor of child sexual abuse, prostituted minor, makes us more intentional in our language and recognizes that through using intentional language, we can further adapt to the needs of the movement. So another example of how we can use intentional language is understanding how the language we use represents the idea or phenomena that we are attempting to share. So for example, in speaking about the vulnerability of victims, we need to phrase our language so we're representing vulnerability without victim blaming. So an individual is not solely vulnerable because of aspects or characteristics of their identity, but rather the systems that create vulnerabilities. So it isn't a person's race that makes them vulnerable, it is racism. It is the policy and social norms that surround race within our country and the world that make individuals of a particular race more vulnerable. So it is not their individual race or ethnicity that makes them vulnerable to sex trafficking or other health outcomes, but rather how society and people respond to their race based on how it's built into our society's policies, beliefs, and resources. So making sure that we're using language that describes the phenomena that we're attempting to share, and we're being intentional about what the language we use, how it promotes ideas in the movement. So similarly, it isn't a person's gender identity, but rather bias against women and LGBTQ+ people that creates vulnerability. It isn't an individual's mental health status that makes them more vulnerable, but is the lack of community support or protections for people with mental illness. If we use language such as a person's race, their gender identity, or their mental health status to describe someone's vulnerability to sex trafficking or other health outcomes, we would be saying, our language may make it sound that we would be saying that this identity that an individual owns and cannot control is the reason they are being trafficked, which is not true. So it is the system of racism, social gender norms, or the lack of community level support that create vulnerability. Being intentional that our language says that it's the systems that increase risk factors and create vulnerability for individuals, and increase opportunities for perpetrators to take advantage of vulnerability. And so choosing language that represents the big picture of the anti-trafficking movement, that steers away from individual level of thinking or victim blaming, will help us to create broader, more sustainable change, because we're using language that demonstrates the complexities of trafficking and how it exists from the societal level in. And so now we're going to move into talking a little bit about sensationalized imagery. So really quickly in the chat, what stands out to you about this imagery used to depict human trafficking? They're all appropriately pitiable. Disembodied hands. Often presenting the eyes. I noticed my anxiety rose when I saw them. youthful, fear, bondage, potentially triggering. Yeah, so this collage was taken from an individual who simply typed human trafficking into the Google Images search. And these are the types of photos that popped up continuously. And so pictures such as these are extremely sensationalizing human trafficking and the movement, the anti-trafficking movement. They invoke fear, as Chris mentioned. They make trafficking seem obscure in that it only happens in scary ways. All the pictures are in black and white. They show often the hands that I think are attempting to demonstrate power over the youth and females, as someone mentioned. And these are using this type of imagery to depict anti-trafficking movement is potentially extremely harmful. If someone's looking for what they see in these photos and attempting to look for victims or survivors of trafficking, they may be looking for victims with handcuffs or that their hands are tied. So they'd be missing the individuals that are being trafficked in plain sight or through other types of control or coercion. Also, individuals who are being trafficked in other ways, but only see these photos of human trafficking might not identify as victims simply because they're not experiencing what is displayed in these sensationalized pictures that are being used within the anti-trafficking movement. And so I was noting a few stereotypes or fallacies that are being depicted in these photos. And so I noted a few of the same, that photos such as this could depict that women and girls are trafficked and men are the traffickers. In these 10 photos, we do not see any depiction of anyone other than a young female being trafficked. It also attempts to demonstrate that all trafficking situations are forceful, which we know is not the case. There's different types of trafficking, whether that be familial. We know that trafficking often occurs among people that you trust. And so just thinking about what this imagery, what the intention is behind it, and which may be to evoke fear, discomfort, but that it doesn't necessarily propel the movement forward. It doesn't show us different types of trafficking. It just invokes fear, and then it doesn't help us identify types of victims. I think these images also reinforce the idea that rescue is needed. Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, so just making sure that we're intentional about the imagery we use as well as the language. In the IRENA project, also have a section about tips for producing both imagery and language by media and journalists when discussing the anti-trafficking movement. And so they also noted that the pictures we saw on the last slide are what is often used or was used to promote the anti-trafficking movement. And so here are the few of the tips. They have lots more tips on their website that they provide when reporting on human trafficking and using images in the movement. And so 1, use pictures that accurately represent the experience you are sharing. So the images should be able to depict the theme or the experience that you're sharing. So for example, pictures that you would use to represent labor trafficking would be different than pictures you would use to represent familial trafficking. And swapping the two with the experience you're sharing about would create confusion about types of trafficking. And so just being intentional about that, you should be able to understand how the image relates to what you're sharing. Use pictures that accurately represent the experiences that occur within your community. They recommend that if you've worked with survivors in your community, ask them types of media illustrations that they would prefer to use to help share their experience in the community, to depict real life experiences of human trafficking within your area and your organization, and that they should be reflective of the experiences that are occurring, so that it's helpful for sharing knowledge and education within the area. And use pictures that are representative of multiple experiences of trafficking. If your organization is only putting out imagery about one type of trafficking, there's the possibility that victims or others will not understand other types of trafficking, and victims may go missed or unserved. As I mentioned on the last slide, if survivors or victims of trafficking are only seeing one type of imagery or language or information shared, they may not self-identify as a victim and may lose access to resources because of that. And providing multiple perspectives is more holistic of the movement and everything that we've learned about how trafficking exists. And so we'll discuss later in the presentation a bit about the importance of evaluating our work in the movement and improving our work continuously as we learn new information as the movement grows. But the IRENA project mentions one way to do that in terms of imagery and intentional language is to hire a survivor leader in your area to give constructive feedback on the pictures being used or the language that your organization is using. So not only is it important to ask prior for suggestions or input and base pictures on experiences, but also asking after it's been posted almost as an evaluation process allows you to see how the public or survivor leader perceives your imagery and the language that you're using and putting out in your materials and as your organization's work. Does anyone have any questions or comments on the section about sensationalized language and imagery before we move on to talk about inclusivity? So it is extremely important in the movement and in our work that we are being inclusive to individuals who are either victims of trafficking or those who are at increased vulnerability. But as well, inclusivity can mean including various types of trafficking or various experiences of trafficking, and just making sure in the movement that we're thinking about the ways in which the movement manifests among different populations, different environments, in different ways. And so a common trap that can occur within the anti-trafficking movement is the misunderstanding of what it means to be inclusive. In our survey, so when we developed the matrix, we reached out to the curriculum organizations that wanted to be included and sent them a survey about their content and logistics. And we asked them, is your curriculum, it says survivor involvement here at the top, but that's supposed to say gender inclusivity. Is your curriculum gender inclusive? And this was a check all that applies. So was it intended for men, women, non-binary, and other gender identities? Was it inclusive of LGBTQ plus youth with relevant statistics and scenarios? Does it use they, them language as opposed to he, she? Does it use scenarios that represent a variety of gender identities? Is it intended to be taught in mixed gender settings or intended to be taught in gender specific settings? And so I think the second question in understanding inclusivity is extremely important. Is your curriculum inclusive of LGBTQ plus youth with relevant statistics and scenarios? And so this question makes sure to point out that is your curriculum inclusive beyond just putting in they, them pronouns, but is it inclusive to experiences of both marginalized and more vulnerable populations with relevant statistics and scenarios? So being inclusive is not simply just having an example where the individual is a transgender female youth, but rather details a trafficking scenario that is relevant to the experiences of LGBTQ plus youth. So using a scenario or statistic that would be more likely to occur among a transgender female youth population. It's not simply just putting in the title and then putting a scenario that is more common among cisgender straight youth. It's being inclusive to experiences and scenarios among vulnerable populations. Is the knowledge and data that you're sharing as an organization inclusive experiences that various populations experience? And for different populations, being inclusive experiences may look different. So for an example, in your work, an LGBTQ plus youth's experience in trafficking may be coercion by threats of outing them. So a scenario could include an experience in which their threat is being outed. And in an undocumented individual's experience in trafficking may be coercion or threat of reporting to immigration. Or for a male youth, the coercion might involve psychological manipulation or taunting about not being manly enough. So being inclusive in the anti-trafficking movement is not just simply checking a box that we've provided diverse examples, but rather it being inclusive of types of trafficking that occur among varying populations based on their experiences. So being inclusive to the differing experiences that occur by different populations. And being inclusive that the risk factors for one population may vary among another population, and that then the scenarios and education and materials that we share should be representative of that. So another common pitfall in talking about inclusivity is that at times when we focus on human trafficking, our minds and the minds of the general public often go straight to sex trafficking, but making sure that in the movement we're being inclusive to labor trafficking. And so, as we discussed earlier, it's important to use language and examples of multiple types of trafficking so that we're representing the multitude of ways that trafficking occurs. So one common trap in the anti-trafficking movement is to say something like signs of human trafficking include, and then we only reference signs for sex trafficking. And not inclusive of other types of trafficking, such as labor trafficking. And so labor trafficking, while believed to be more prevalent than sex trafficking, has a lot less awareness surrounding what to look for or how to identify labor trafficking. And so labor trafficking occurs in multiple venues, whether that be agricultural, horticultural, fishing, construction, mineral, textile, food service, domestic work, entertainment, health and beauty. And so as we talked on the last slide, being inclusive to that, when talking about labor trafficking in our work, we have to be inclusive of where it exists, and using examples that only occur in agriculture could be harmful to those who are experiencing labor trafficking in entertainment or health and beauty. And so examples in some possible ways in which labor trafficking could occur could include working excessively long or unusual hours, tricked into working. Maybe they came into an expectation of this job that didn't pan out, and now they're doing work that they didn't originally think they were going to be doing. Discussing a debt that they have to pay off, whether that be debt bondage. And so just knowing and being thoughtful about creating inclusive information that not only discusses that labor trafficking isn't often thought of when we think about human trafficking, but that it occurs in these different fields and that it can appear in different ways. And so being inclusive in our scenarios and our intentional language and our imagery about the ways that labor trafficking can occur. And so creating fact sheets or having intentional conversations or language or imagery about the ways that you can be inclusive to various types of trafficking will be beneficial in creating a more sustainable and broad approach to the anti-trafficking movement, and being more inclusive of the experiences of victims and survivors of trafficking. And so now we'll move into representing survivors' perspectives. And a common trap in prevention work that I believe comes from a place of good intentions is, for example, taking an experience of a survivor of trafficking. And so maybe you feel like you've done the research and you're talking to individuals who have experiences in trafficking, and then saying survivors need this. And so basing the context of your work off of the experiences of one survivor you have information from. And so it's important to consider that not all survivors share the same beliefs and experiences. And so there will be benefits to listening to a diversity of survivors. So keeping in mind that being a survivor, again, is not a description of someone's relationship to the experience, but or that it is a description of someone's relationship to experience, but it's not their identity. And it's important that we're inclusive to a diversity of survivors' experiences and represent the multitude of perspectives that exists. And so in the survey that we did send to curriculum organizations, we did ask about the involvement of trafficking survivors in the development of their curriculum. And that ranged from level 1, where the curriculum was developed primarily by survivors, to level 4, where survivors were not directly involved in the development. And so giving schools the opportunity to see what survivor involvement looked like in the curriculum that they may be choosing, and how that may influence their decision. And so only one human trafficking prevention curriculum of the 14 was developed primarily by survivors of human trafficking. 7 had survivors on the curriculum development team, and 12 of the 14 noted that they utilized review and feedback from survivors. But 2 organizations noted that they do not involve survivors in the development or creation of their trafficking curriculum. And I think it's just important to note that we've talked today so many times about the importance of taking in the perspectives and the knowledge and evidence that we have, and the experiences of survivors, so that we're making sure we're representing how the movement is currently, the experiences of the movement currently. And so curriculum imagery language that represents the experiences of survivors, and that can influence the risk and protective factors for human trafficking that are identified by survivors of trafficking, is extremely important. A curriculum or language or materials that include survivors in the decision-making process, and the development, and then we implement the recommendations, will create a more informed approach. Keeping in mind that survivors, as I said, are not, their identity is not being a survivor, and they may have lived experience in violence prevention, trauma-informed care, curriculum design, effective outreach, harm reduction, cultural competence, that they may have expertise in other things that can be extremely beneficial to creating an informed approach. Representing the ideas, perspectives, experiences of various survivors will help you to avoid common traps that we've discussed today, as a result of being informed by real life experiences. And then we're going to move into our last section. We have a bit of time if anyone wants to ask any questions really quick before we move on. Okay, in today's last segment of the presentation, we're going to shift a bit from recognizing common traps that exist in prevention work to how we can, as an organization, the movement, improve our processes and systems so that we can continue to avoid these common traps. Instead, promote positive growth and improvement based on evaluation and the resources that we have and the evidence that we have. To begin, let's talk about what is evidence and why should we use it in the movement. Using evidence and research has been proven will ensure that our organization, the movement, continues to steer away from common traps, because we already know they are harmful and ineffective. Previously, we talked about what it means to be an informed decision maker for youth, and for individuals in the movement, and in how we teach elements of the anti-trafficking movement. So the same concept applies to how your organization conducts everyday work and decides your focus for conducting work in the anti-trafficking movement. Being evidence-informed means that you're using the best available research and knowledge to inform the design and implementation of a program or curriculum or intervention. So being evidence-informed means that you are looking at research that has already been completed, whether that be systematic research or speaking with survivors of trafficking, and listening to their values or opinions or experiences with other programs, or stakeholder interviews in your community. Being evidence-informed is advantageous because you're getting information about what's successful or unsuccessful from multiple sources. And so evidence-informed work helps us to avoid reinventing the wheel. And this can be in both a good and a bad way. So maybe we have already discovered promising solutions that are tried and true in the anti-trafficking movement about what's successful. Then we don't need to reinvent the wheel and invent a new project or solution, because we can go off of the research that already exists. But it also allows us to avoid negatively reinventing the wheel, which is repeating past mistakes, past common traps that have existed within prevention work. So past research and evidence will guide us to not utilize those same practices and avoid repeating harmful mistakes that could set us back in the movement. It could help us to avoid those common traps that we discussed earlier and allow us to keep moving forward. If we use evidence about the common traps that have already occurred, then we don't need to keep repeating them. Being evidence-informed helps us to increase the likelihood of improving outcomes for survivors and encouraging widespread implementation of effective practices. So through finding an evidence-informed base of experience-backed practices or experiences of survivors, we can create a solution that will create more impactful, effective long-term outcomes because it's based on experiences that are occurring. If as a movement, we're all evidence informed, looking at what the research says, what the stakeholders say, what survivors say, what their experiences are, we can create widespread across the movement solutions that will be more long-term. And so as a movement, if we focus on the evidence and avoid common traps and stereotypes that perpetuate the outdated, the non-evidence-based experiences of trafficking that have been shared previously in the movement, if we focus on what we know through evidence, we can better move forward in the movement and create a better improvement process. And so it's important to recognize that both in the anti-trafficking movement and in life, there's a difference between being popular as an organization or curriculum or material and being an effective organization or curriculum or material. And so at times, popularity is conflated with effectiveness. And it's not always intentional, but can be harmful if we don't distinguish the difference. And so being popular may mean that you are liked or admired, or you're used often because you're shared. But being effective means that you demonstrate success in producing a desired result. And in the survey we sent to curriculum organizations, one respondent to our survey noted the impossibility of accurately measuring who had avoided being victimized as a result of receiving their curriculum. And they pointed to the high number of referrals that their program receives as evidence of effectiveness. And I don't think it was intentional. I think that there was a misunderstanding of what it means to be an effective curriculum and how you're evaluated. And so it's important to note that having high referrals is a good thing, but we need to be careful about what we measure as success or effectiveness of our program or our work in the anti-trafficking movement. And while we may not be able to define the number of individuals who avoided being victimized, there are measures for understanding the effectiveness of a program, and they have to be specific and intentional, and not all measures can demonstrate success or effectiveness. And so in order to avoid common prevention traps, such as inaccurately measuring success, it's important to monitor and evaluate your organization and your work so that you're contributing to the movement and you know that your work is effective in what the anti-trafficking movement is attempting to accomplish. And so I won't go into too much detail about the methods of evaluation, but it's important to ask yourself how you can evaluate your organization and its work, and you can continue to improve your goals and your work. So monitoring, your organization can monitor your work day to day. It's tracking of implementation progress through periodic data collection with the goal of providing indicators of progress throughout the implementation of your work. And so questions could include, how many people did this informational graphic reach on social media today? Or was this graphic more popular on Instagram or Facebook, or did it reach more people on Instagram or Facebook? But it helps you to understand various aspects of the work that you're doing and helps you to achieve the best progress. Evaluation is used to determine the effectiveness of a specific program, and this is done through setting specific goals and determining how they will be measured. So questions could include, did this graphic increase awareness of common risk and protective factors for our county? Or was this campaign more successful with certain groups of students than others? And maybe that'll give you information about the populations that you were attempting to reach, and maybe you weren't putting the right risk and protective factors or the right scenarios or statistics. An outcome evaluation looks to assess changes in the social norms or the access to resources, changes in behaviors, attitudes, or beliefs. And the point of this slide is just to say that as your program or your program organization continues to monitor and evaluate your work and how it's contributing to the movement, you can engage in continuously improving the quality of the work and what you're producing. You can highlight areas in which you may need improvement, or you can say, we did this really well, and this is how we could take aspects of this and incorporate into other elements of our work. And so this often follows the plan, do, check, act, planning what you want to accomplish, doing what you planned on doing, checking the results, and if successful, standardizing that into the rest of your work. And if unsuccessful, restarting the cycle to create further improvement. And so using this to effectively measure what your work is doing will allow you to see common traps that maybe your organization is falling into, and how to avoid them in the future. And so we discussed a little bit earlier that there are at times unintended impacts or harms of work within the trafficking movement. And so in evaluating and monitoring and using evidence-informed work, if we're not doing those steps, we may create unintended impacts or harm. Unintended impacts or harms within the movement can exist not only among victims or survivors of human trafficking, but also those who are impacted by anti-trafficking messages and policies that are put into place. So for example, we discussed this at the beginning of the presentation, that when Session Law 2015-279 was passed, that mandated the inclusion of evidence-based human trafficking in schools, there was only one evidence-based human trafficking prevention curriculum, and there still is only one at this time. And so that curriculum that exists is only intended for adolescent females and requires a substantial cost to put it into place. And so North Carolina put this mandate into place with suspected positive intentions of saying we want evidence-informed, research-backed curriculum in our schools, but without the adequate support or resources of available curriculum, or how to identify a curriculum for schools, or a lot of schools, when I reached out to them, didn't even know that this mandate was in place. It created unintended harmful impacts where schools were left to identify a curriculum that needed to be evidence-based, but didn't have support or resources or knowledge that was necessary. And so putting a mandate into place created unintended impact when it had good intentions. A second example is the increase in criminalization as a response to the human trafficking that is occurring. But increasing criminalization unintentionally puts more Black and brown folks in contact with police in an unjust criminal justice system that is not supportive to survivors or victims of trafficking. And so similar to the first example, in which something was criminalization was increased with maybe a positive intention as a response to trafficking, aiming to serve victims of trafficking by prosecuting traffickers. But currently there's not the proper support or just systems in place for this to be a successful response. And so Black and brown victims of trafficking are working within an unjust criminal justice system, trying to find justice for their trafficking experiences when the system may be working against them. And furthermore, in prosecuting traffickers, the Washington Post put out an article in which they looked at cases between 2005 and 2015 and found that the type of trafficking case that carries the highest penalties and that were more likely to be prosecuted were significantly more likely to be young, Black, and male. And so as using criminalization as a way to solve the trafficking experiences within our country is an unjust way and creating unintended impacts or harms. So being critical and thinking critically about the ways in which we are creating policies or potential solutions, and that they may have unintended impacts or harm, and how can we avoid those prior to putting these actions into place. And so while both examples may have been developed with the intention of sharing knowledge or education or justice as a movement, we need to be more evidence informed and create more support and share resources so that we are continuing to grow and improve the movement successfully without creating unintended impacts or harm. In the anti-trafficking movement, we have grown substantially in our improvements and knowledge base and the evidence that we use and the knowledge that we share. And we must continue to work forward and move forward as we recognize and avoid common traps in our prevention work. Thank you all for joining me today. If anyone has any questions or comments, you can put them in the chat now. And I also included my email if anyone has questions or comments after I leave today. Thanks, everyone.